Welcome to Top Notch Online TV, a paragon of excellence. Today with you is teacher Risper from PCEA Kikuyu High School, a teacher of English and Literature, an examiner as well as an author. In today's episode, you continue to tackle oral literature and you're going to yet another example of oral literature. In the previous episode, we were able to tackle short forms of literature. As we continue, we are now going to tackle narratives in this particular episode. Narratives are simply what you're calling stories. And before I can go to the types of stories, I'll be looking at what are the features of oral narratives. What makes this one from judgment that it easily can be identified as a narrative. A narrative has certain features, and features should not be confused with stylistic devices. Stylistic devices are applicable to any item of literature, but then features of oral narratives, they include the following. One of the features of oral narratives we're going to talk about, we're going to look at opening formula. The opening formula, for example, includes words such as once upon a time, a long, long time ago, or another example, there once lived. Those are what you're calling examples of the opening formula. And then when you're looking at the opening formula, what is the function of the opening formula? It is a popular question in our high school examinable areas. What is the function of the opening formula? Number one, the opening formula is used to draw the attention of the audience. Once someone goes ahead and says, once upon a time, we already start to set ourselves for listening to a narrative. Apart from drawing the attention of the listeners, we go ahead and talk about it marks the beginning of a narrative. Where we are talking about once upon a time is where our narrative begins from. The third function of the opening formula, let's talk about it identifies the narrator. The person who goes ahead and says once upon a time is supposed to be the same person who goes ahead and gives us a story. And finally, at number 4, another usage of the opening formula, let's talk about it moves the audience or the listeners from the world of reality to the world of fantasy. You forget that you're inside a classroom. Now you start to engage your mind into the listening of the story. You can even see yourself, or you can even see that hare within that forest. We go to yet another feature of oral narratives that you're going to call the closing formula. The closing formula, examples include, there ends my story. Another popular example of closing formula we can talk about, and they lived happily ever after. This one is mostly in fairy tales. Once they have overcome their problems, you talk about, and they lived happily ever after. What are the functions of the closing formula? Among the functions of the closing formula, we're going to talk about it marks the end of a narrative. When someone says, there ends my story, we expect that they are done with the narration. Number 2, about the function of the closing formula, we are going to talk about it brings the audience back into the world of reality from the world of fantasy or from the world of imagination. These people who are being narrated to the story, they were flowing with the story. They can almost see the hare being punished and all that. But when someone says, there ends my story, your mind is supposed to drift back into the world of reality. Maybe you go back into being inside a classroom. The other usage of the closing formula we're going to talk about, it paves way for the next narrator. We can't be raising our hands asking to give a story and this person has not said, there ends my story. But once the person says, there ends my story, it gives us a green light that we can go ahead and also prepare to be the next narrator. Therefore, number 3, we said it paves way for the next narrator. Number 3 feature of oral narratives, we have something that we call timelessness. Timelessness is the exact year that the story took place. You're not being told, you're just being told once upon a time. And examples of timelessness, they tend to overlap with examples of the opening formula. Therefore, it is advisable that once you identify once upon a time as timelessness, and you are supposed to give yet another answer, don't go and identify the opening formula. You either choose the opening formula or timelessness, but in no way is the explanation the same. We go to yet another feature of oral narratives, a feature that we call dialogue. Most of the times you see that as you are narrating the story, there are other times that we shall go ahead and make our participants, the characters within the story, to also speak. The hare goes ahead and it is speaking to maybe the lion. We make them to speak their exact words, and the exact words will be enclosed within inverted commas, speech marks, to show that these were the exact words of the old lady or the hare or any other character in a story. We still go further and give another feature of oral narratives. The other feature of oral narratives, we call it fantasy. It is only in oral narratives that some things can happen that in reality these things cannot happen. For instance, you can be talking about, in the stories of Aladdin, someone tapping at a carpet and the carpet changes and it becomes a mode of transport. Tapping on a carpet, it becomes the magic carpet and they end up flying using that magic carpet. That is an item of fantasy. It cannot happen in real life. Another example of fantasy, you can be talking about an ogre swallowing a whole village. And after we cut open the belly of the ogre, what happens? All the people come back to life, walking and even carrying their possessions with them. We are wondering, in a normal scientific explanation, they should have been digested already, but then they come out walking as if nothing ever happened. That is yet another example of fantasy. Another feature of oral narratives, we have the element of repetition. There are other times that in an oral narrative, it is popular that an action might be emphasized on by way of repetition. They can be talking about, they went and went and went and went until they got to their grandmother's house. That is a feature of an oral narrative. Yet another feature of oral narrative, we are going to call it personification. Personification is a style in literature, I agree, but it is still a feature of oral narratives. And personification is mostly applicable when you're talking about a certain type of a story that you're calling a fable. A story that has animal characters. We see that animals are engaged in activities that are only particular to humans. For instance, an example of personification, we see something like animals dancing. We still see something like animals speaking and even calling for elections, having their leader in the lion. These are all examples of something that you can call personification. Last but not least, another feature of oral narratives, let's talk about moral lesson. Literature is supposed to inculcate moral values in people. For example, when you're talking about an ogre has an insatiable type of an appetite, and in the end, we see that a negative end comes to an ogre. Therefore, people can be advised using an ogre narrative to be having positive characters, something that you're calling virtues. For example, we should not be greedy. But then again, when you're giving a moral lesson, be very careful that you don't give it in the negative. For instance, when I'm supposed to say, we should be honest as opposed to we should not lie. You're not supposed to tell us what we should not do. Tell us exactly what we should do. If we should not lie, what can you tell us? You tell us that we should always tell the truth. That is it about the features of oral narratives. Before I can go ahead and talk about the types of narratives, but then I'll summarize by way of, I'll recap my lesson by talking about features of oral narratives include the following: opening formula, closing formula, fantasy, personification, dialogue, moral lesson, as well as timelessness. It brings me to yet another session of narratives. What else can you say about narratives? We're going to go ahead and talk about the different types of narratives. As I begin, first of all, I'll classify narratives into two major categories. Some of the narratives can be human tales. They can be including human characters. Other narratives will include characters that are animals. Therefore, we call them fables. Narratives can be human tales or they can be fables, depending on your characters. Are they human? Are they animals? As we continue, we go ahead and mention the other types of narratives away from the broader classification. We go ahead and talk about myths. Another one is legends, dilemma. We still have a trickster narrative as well as etiological, or in other words, you can call them the etiological or explanatory narratives. And the last one is an ogre or a monster narrative. About each of the categories of the narratives, I'll give the characteristics so that you're able to know what type of a story am I dealing with. And for that student sitting for their final examination, maybe the KCSE examination, if you're being asked to identify the type of a narrative for 2 marks, you identify it and then you give a feature that made you aware and classify it into that particular category. First of all, let me talk about an ogre narrative. An ogre narrative is also called a monster narrative. And about an ogre narrative, it talks about characters that are not human. And these characters are portrayed usually in some kind of a scary manner. They're talking about a character maybe who has one big eye on the forehead and even maybe another one at the back of their head. They usually are portrayed as very big. They tend to want to harm human beings, and they can also transform themselves. In other words, what are the features of an ogre narrative? Number one, it must contain one among the characters who's an ogre or a monster. Another feature that will make you be able to identify it as an ogre narrative, we talk about the ogre will always try to harm a human being. At other times, they manage to harm the human being. Feature number 3, an ogre has the capability of transforming itself. It transforms itself, for instance, into a very handsome young man to enable it to mingle with the human being. Another feature we see about an ogre narrative, an ogre usually has an insatiable appetite. An appetite whereby it can come and demand for, give me your daughter. But then it never gets satisfied. Next time it comes for your son, next time for the husband, and finally for even the one who was providing food for it. An ogre is supposed to be a representation of evil because at the end of the day, we never see an ogre amounting to any good. All the time it is propagating acts of evil. Another thing about an ogre story, we learn that good always triumphs over evil. That is why in most ogre stories we see, there emerges maybe a hero within the community, a hero who kills the ogre and saves the day. Therefore, in an ogre narrative, we are always supposed to learn that good will always triumph over evil. The second type of a narrative we are going to talk about, let's talk about a trickster narrative. A trickster narrative is the one that involves tricks. We have a big animal pitted against a small one. And at the end of the day, in our trickster narrative, we usually see that the small animal usually manages to outsmart the big animal. Therefore, what lesson do you learn from a trickster narrative? We are learning that it is better to be clever than to be big. It advocates for intellectual might as opposed to the physical might. You find that the hare, as small as it is, it manages to outsmart the elephant and the hippo. It manages to challenge them into a tug of war whereby they're supposed to compete on who is stronger between them, and each one of them thinks that it is pitted against the hare. Then they begin to pull. Little do they know it is the elephant being pitted against the hippopotamus. Therefore, you see that the animals, as much as they're big, they lack their reasoning capacity. And it is not a must that the hare becomes the one who's doing the tricks. In other words, you're talking about, in a trickster narrative, we have two characters. One among them, we have the trickster. The trickster is the one who is tricking the other one, and the trickster is usually the small animal. Examples of tricksters include the snail. It can still be the hare. It can still be the fox, the one that is using their intellectual might, the one that is using the brain. We have the other character within a trickster narrative that you're calling the dupe. The dupe now is the foolish one that falls for the trick. And the dupe is usually the bigger of the two animals. The dupe in our African stories mostly have the hyena. At other times we have the elephant, we even have the donkey, we even have maybe the hippo. We go to yet another type of a narrative. I'll call it my number 3. My number 3 type of a narrative, I'll be talking about a dilemma narrative. About a dilemma narrative, someone is presented with two options, none of which is favorable. In choosing one, you are losing on the other side. Let me give a practical example. A thug walks into your house and then they're asking you, tell me to kill one, either your father or your mother. That is being put into a situation you're calling a dilemma. A dilemma we can talk about being put between a rock and a hard place. And you're supposed to be taking your time before you can give an answer within a dilemma narrative, because you need to support your answer as to why you have chosen choice A and not choice B. And this one goes back to the morality. Let me present maybe another example of a dilemma. We can be talking about, for instance, someone who is a Christian, and then as they were somewhere resting on top of a tree, they witnessed a person killing another. Then the dilemma comes in this way. The person who was the perpetrator of the killing is your own blood brother, but then as a Christian, you have the moral obligation to report a wrongdoing, but then you're left with that hard choice. Are you going to report your brother? That is yet another dilemma. As we're moving on with the types of stories, we've already tackled 3. We've tackled an ogre. We've gone ahead to a trickster as well as a dilemma, taking me to number 4. Number 4, we are going to talk about a story that we call an etiological narrative. An etiological narrative is also what you're calling an explanatory kind of a story. It tries to explain natural phenomena, but then we attribute a story to it. For example, why the tortoise has a hard shell can be one example. Another one can be why the hyena limps. Why the zebra has black and white stripes are the kind of stories that you're calling etiological or explanatory kind of narratives. And these stories usually bear the title why. They give a reason as to why a natural phenomena is the way that it is. Taking me to my 5th story that I'll be calling a legend. A legend is a story about heroes and heroines within a certain community. By my definition, you saw that I talked about a certain community. For example, we can talk about Luanda Magere among the Luo people. We can talk about Syokimau among the Akamba people, and so on and so forth. About a legend, what you're supposed to be looking out for, features of a legend, they include a story that is talking about a hero or a heroine. Like Syokimau was a woman, therefore it's talking about a heroine. Another feature about a legend is that these people offered a certain exemplary service to their people. That is why they're being remembered. For example, Syokimau was a powerful medicine woman as well as a prophetess. About Luanda Magere, what exemplary service did he offer to his people? Luanda Magere, we are being told he was a fierce warrior who always led the Luo people into victory against the Kipsigis people whenever a war was waged. Feature number 3 about a legend, you're talking about mystery surrounds either their birth or their death. For example, about Syokimau, we are being told she went into a deep sleep. We are not told that she died normally. She went into a deep sleep. About Lwanda Magere, we see that he died after the piercing of his shadow. The more they were piercing on his shadow, the more he was falling, and he went ahead and died. Another feature of a legend we are going to talk about, their downfall comes mostly from betrayal from people who are close to them. As the story of Lwanda Magere is told, he was a hero among the Luo community, but then he married a daughter from within their enemy, a daughter from the Kipsigis people. At the end of the day, the Kipsigis woman discovered the source of his strength, and she went and reported to his people, and they ended up knowing that his strength lay in his shadow, and that is how he was killed. Another feature of legends is that they are community-based. They are based on a certain community. Taking me to my story, number 6, to my 6th kind of a narrative, we're going to talk about a myth. A myth is a story that can be considered by definition a religious story. It has a superior being at the center of that story. And at other times, we see that a myth will not be having an opening formula because they talk about it is set at the beginning of time. It is talking about origin of some phenomena that is otherwise complex for the human mind to understand. Phenomena such as death. When someone is asking, why are people dying? When someone is asking, where did human beings come from? Those are phenomena that a human being's mind is finding it complex to understand. Therefore, we attribute a myth to tackle such a phenomena, to explain them away. For example, we're being told maybe among the Yoruba people, how do they attribute the creation story? According to them, the creation story, there was God at the center of myth stories usually have a superior being. So among the Yoruba, they talk about God was molding the human beings using clay. But then when it came to molding the black man, the African person, what happened is that when the African person was put into the kiln to dry up, God forgot and ended up giving a lot of time for the African man. Therefore, he ended up getting burnt. Therefore, that is why the African people are black in color. We also use myths to explain something like origin of a certain community. For example, among the Agikuyu in Kenya, we talk about the origin of the Agikuyu, and the story attributed is that they came from Agikuyu and Mombi. That is it about our types of narratives, but as a way of cautioning, as I'm coming to an end of my presentation, I'll be talking about majorly the type of stories you're supposed to talk about. You look at an ogre narrative, you look at a dilemma, you look at a legend, as well as a myth. And these ones can be considered under human tales. But at other times, you find that you have human characters, but none of these stories are forthcoming. At that juncture, you can safely play by saying it is a human tale, and then you go and give evidences that the characters are human. On the other side that I said, we rarely identify a story as a fable because through a fable mostly, we shall be looking at an etiological story or a trickster. But then when none of these features are forthcoming, the story does not involve a trick, neither does it try to explain a natural phenomena, how it came to be. Therefore, you can go back and talk about it as a fable. That is it about our narratives. In yet another episode, we shall now be looking at the last example of oral literature. We are going to look at songs. Until next time, it is a goodbye from us.